Hello and welcome back. Let's finish up chapter 9. We're getting into the transfiguration of Jesus Christ, which I definitely have not always understood and very much appreciated the notes that were in this Bible. So if you're not really following, I am happy to share what is here. 8 days later, he takes Peter, John, and James up on a mountain to pray. Before I get on my praying soapbox again, I wanted to point out, you notice how his besties are Peter, John, and James. They get singled out in a lot of things and they get to be a part of some of the more personal or exclusive things. Remember, they were part of the exclusive resurrection, we call it, for the girl who died, and they raised her, right? Jesus brought her back to life and with her father and mother, and he only wanted those 3 disciples with him. So I call them the PJs. So I just want to say, take a look at your circle and who are the PJs in your life? Are they spiritual leaders that you can lean on and grow with? Is it an iron sharpens iron kind of a situation? Not that they were sharpening Jesus because he's Jesus, so let's not compare it that way, but you know what I mean. So he's going to pray again, and he takes his besties with him, and some very cool supernatural things happen. His face was transformed and his clothes became dazzling white. That's verse 29, by the way. Suddenly, 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared and began talking with Jesus. They were glorious to see, and they were speaking about his exodus from the world, which was about to be fulfilled in Jerusalem. Exodus is like an exit, right? So when he's leaving. But his besties were sleeping, and they missed this whole show. And so they wake up because they had fallen asleep. When they woke up, they saw Jesus' glory and the 2 men standing with him. As Moses and Elijah were starting to leave, Peter, not even knowing what he was saying, blurted out, "Master, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But even as he was saying this, a cloud overshadowed them and terror gripped them as the cloud covered them. And then it says, then a voice from the cloud says, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." When the voice finished, Jesus was there alone. They didn't tell anyone at that time what they had seen. So first of all, if you're one of the PJs, you're like, what did I just see? But you're trying to respond because you're like probably still groggy. I think they were still groggy from having been sleeping. And they're trying to like come up and be like, yeah, this is normal because it's Jesus. But like, no. And so at the end, it says, right, they didn't tell anyone at that time what they had seen. I often wonder if they started doubting what they saw. Do you ever experience something so out of the norm, supernatural, something wild, and you're like, there's no way that happened. There's like, maybe it didn't happen that way. Maybe I am like, and you just start like changing their narrative in your head about it because you're like, there's no way. I wonder if they maybe started doubting themselves that way, and maybe that's why they didn't tell anyone what they had seen. But I'm going to read the notes here. It says, Jesus took them, the PJs, to the top of a mountain to show them who he really was, as in not merely a great prophet, but God's own son. Moses, representing the law, and Elijah, representing the prophets, appeared with Jesus. Then God's voice singled out Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah who possessed divine authority. Jesus would fulfill both the law and the prophets. And going back to this cloud, there are a lot of references to God speaking as like the voice of thunder. There's dark clouds mentioned when he's near. There's just clouds mentioned. So I don't know. I just kind of find that interesting. You know that saying that's like, oh, if it's raining on your wedding day, it's actually good luck. I wonder if it's also because the cloud situation, the dark clouds, and how that's was seen as God's presence in some passages in the Bible. I don't know. Why did Peter suggest these shelters? When Peter suggested making 3 shelters, he may have been thinking about the Festival of Shelters, where shelters were set up to commemorate the Exodus, which is God's deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Peter wanted to keep Moses and Elijah with them, but this was not what God wanted. Peter's desire to build memorials for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah may also show his understanding that real faith is built on 3 cornerstones: the law, the prophets, and Jesus. But Peter grew in his understanding, and eventually he would write of Jesus as the cornerstone of the church. Only Jesus. So I had a side note here in response to that one, as kind of just a reminder that spiritual growth is a process, right? Like what we're learning now is so great, and it's such a good understanding and a great foundation. And a year from now, we could have even more added to this, right? So let's not be, again, so close-minded to think that if we just understand once, we're going to always have understood to the capacity of what was meant. There's always more to learn with God, and that's what's actually really fun. There's always more when it comes to God. So here's the last note for this passage. As God's son, Jesus has God's power and authority. Thus, his words should be our final authority. If a person's teaching is true, it will agree with Jesus' teachings. Don't be hasty to seek advice and guidance merely from human sources and thereby neglect Christ's message. Test everything you hear against Jesus' words, and you will not be led astray. If we believe he is God's son, then we surely will want to do what he says. One thing I always talk to my mentees about is when they're starting to dive in and understand the word more. You know, we have all these resources. We want to listen to podcasts. We want to listen to other sermons. We want to read all these books that are helpful, and they are. They're all helpful, and they're good resources and they're tools, but they are not the official word. And if we don't know the word for ourselves, then we're going to just fall into believing whatever could be even a false teaching. If we don't know it for ourselves, we're putting ourselves in a vulnerable position to then start following ways that are not of God, that are not of Christ, and were never biblical principles to begin with. It's not about who we're following, because we're not following anyone other than Christ. So let's be mindful of that. And we can always test whatever someone is saying to the Bible. If at any point it contradicts, that's maybe not someone you need to be following. And I get it, we're all human. Sometimes we make mistakes. And if that person, comes to that after being made aware of it, repents and apologizes and corrects himself, great, that's fine. But it's important that we know the word for ourselves first too. So let's get into the disciples not being able to cast out demons. So this guy is begging Jesus to please help him cast out this demon, or not to help him, but to cast out this demon that's in his son, because an evil spirit keeps seizing him, making him scream. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It batters him and hardly ever leaves him alone. He goes, I begged your disciples to cast out the spirit, but they couldn't do it. So Jesus is like, say what? He looks at his disciples. You faithless and corrupt people. Dang. How long must I be with you and put up with you? Then he said to the man, bring your son here. Y'all, that feels very harsh. I'd probably cry if Jesus ever said that to me. But you know what? He's right. We are. But how does them not being able to cast out demons apply to us? Well, let's find out. Jesus performs this very quick and seemingly easy exorcism for him. Says the demon knocked him to the ground and threw him into a violent convulsion, but Jesus rebuked the evil spirit and healed the boy. Then he gave him back to his father. Awe gripped the people as they saw this majestic display of God's power. Remember, the demons understand this whole authority lineup. They might even understand this a lot better than we do. And even they have to submit to his authority. That's pretty powerful. So let me read this note here. Peter, James, and John experienced a wonderful moment on the mountain, and they probably didn't want to leave. Sometimes we, too, have such an inspiring experience that we want to stay where we are, away from the reality and problems of our daily lives, knowing that struggles await us in the valley encourages us to linger on the mountaintop. Yet staying on top of a mountain prohibits our ministering to others. Instead of becoming spiritual giants, we would soon become dwarfed by our self-centeredness. We need times of retreat and renewal, but only so we can return to minister to the world. Our faith must make sense of the mountains as well as on it. So one thing I want to say about the comment that Jesus says to his disciples about you faithless and corrupt people. Well, how do we know that they were faithless? Well, because they couldn't drive out the demons. Jesus already gave them the power to do that. Remember, we already read that earlier. So then why didn't it happen? Because they didn't have faith. It's possible, because this demon sounds wild. They all are, but this one sounds wild, maybe more so than the others, and that maybe they got scared. And then they started to doubt themselves and their power, which then is doubting God's power. And so then it doesn't work, right? Because there's no faith, there's no real authority there, and the demons don't recognize any authority in them because there's no Jesus in them. Do you remember that storm on the boat and how they all panicked because they thought they were going to die and Jesus was sleeping and they were like, Master, we're going to die, and then Jesus had to go and tell the waves and the wind to calm themselves, right? Because they lost faith, because everything they knew had already left their minds. So that's what I think happened there. and perhaps maybe some foreshadowing on pride. I don't know, we'll see. So now we get into the next section where Jesus is giving them a second heads up about his death, right? Like how it's going to go down. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. It's verse 44. But they didn't know what he meant. Its significance was hidden from them, so they couldn't understand it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. There are times that God keeps us from understanding things for a reason, for a very specific reason. And this is like one of those moments. So Jesus says these words. The understanding was hidden from the disciples, but he wants them to remember it because they don't understand it now, but they will. So just remember these key things. The note here says the disciples didn't understand Jesus' words about his death. They still thought of Jesus as only an earthly king, and they were concerned about their places in the kingdom he would set up. So they ignored Jesus' words about his death and began arguing about who would be the greatest. So now we get into this little argument among the disciples about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And it says, but Jesus knew their thoughts, so he brought a little child to his side. Then he said to them, anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me also welcomes my Father who sent me. Whoever is the least among you is the greatest. So they're here like, well, I've done this and I've done that, and they're recalling every conversation, they're recalling every encounter they've been with Jesus on, and they're arguing amongst themselves out of this small group who's going to be the right hand, who's going to be the left hand. And Jesus is like, yo, you still don't get it. Like, you're stuck on this power trip, and that's not what this is. So he brings the child who's completely unrelated to this entire time that he's been doing his ministry with them, and he says, this kid's gonna be the greatest. And so they're just like mind blown. So like, what? He hasn't been here at all. Like, who even is this guy? Do they even go here? Okay, I'll just read the note that's here. It says, our care for others is a measure of our greatness. How much concern do you show for others? This is a vital question that can accurately measure your greatness in God's eyes. How have you expressed your care for others lately, especially the helpless, the needy, the poor, those who can't return your love and concern? Your honest answer to that question will give you a good idea of your real greatness. Remember one of the passages before, Jesus is talking about what good is it if you are only good to people that are nice to you? What good is it if you only lend money to people that can lend it back for you? What good is it to do something for someone just because you know that they'll do something back for you? God is after our hearts, right? And so he wants to know, are we willing to serve those who can do absolutely nothing for us, those who can never repay us back ever? Are we willing to do that? So now we move on to how the disciples find this guy casting out demons in Jesus's name. And they're like telling Jesus, we found this guy who's doing this, but he doesn't follow us. So we were trying to get him to stop. And Jesus is like, why are you going to tell him to stop? If they're not against you, they are for you. Here is where we get a glimpse into like the human side of things for the disciples, right? Because sometimes I think we like to paint this picture as they were just good, upstanding men. I mean, they were his disciples. They never fell short, right? Like, these are the religious leaders to come. So here's a note. The disciples were jealous. 9 of them together had been unable to cast out a single evil spirit. That's the one that we were just talking about. But when they saw a man who was not one of their group casting out demons, they told him to stop. Our pride is hurt when someone else succeeds where we have failed. But Jesus says there is no room for such jealousy in the spiritual warfare of his kingdom. Share Jesus' open arms attitude toward Christian workers outside your group. Rejoice when they are able to bring people to Christ. Look, when we have these moments, sometimes they happen and we didn't mean to act out in the way that we did. Fine. Well, let's consider what happened. Let's understand the correct viewpoint of things and try to correct it for the next time, right? Let's not live out of that mindset always. Let's do better. Once we know better, we need to do better. So now Jesus is getting ready to go to Jerusalem. This is where all that stuff is going to go down. He sends messengers ahead to go into Samaria. So because of this feud, they were not welcome. And so James and John were like, should we call down fire from heaven to burn them up, right? Because they're mad, because they're like, how dare you, right? And Jesus is like, yo, what? Relax. No, that's not how we handle things. So then they went somewhere else. So here are some fun notes. It says, although Jesus knew he would face persecution and death in Jerusalem, he was determined to go there. That kind of resolve should characterize our lives as well. When God gives us a course of action, we must move steadily toward our destination, regardless of the potential hazards that await us there. Something I was thinking about today too is delayed obedience is disobedience. It goes on to say, after Assyria invaded Israel, the northern kingdom, and resettled it with its own people, the mixed race that developed became known as Samaritans. Purebred Jews hated these half breeds, and the Samaritans in turn hated the Jews. So many tensions arose between the two peoples that Jewish travelers between Galilee and southern Judea often would walk around rather than through Samaritan territory, even though this would lengthen their trip considerably. Jesus held no such prejudices, and he sent messengers ahead to get things ready in a Samaritan village, but the village refused to welcome these Jewish travelers who were headed for Jerusalem. Let's not be so blinded by our hatred, distaste, and all of that that we end up missing this incredible blessing that could have been coming our way. That could have been saved. Jesus, the Messiah, could have been walking through in their town, but nope. So James and John didn't want to just stop at like shaking the dust off from their feet. Remember, Jesus told them that's how you're supposed to respond. They wanted to do more. So they wanted to call down fire from heaven on the people as Elijah had done on the servants of a wicked king of Israel. You can read that in 2 Kings chapter 1. When others reject or scorn us, we may feel like retaliating, but we must remember that judgment belongs to God, and we must not expect him to use his power to carry out personal vendettas. Okay, so this last part, because we're talking about following Jesus and the things we have to give up in order to do that and not delay it, right? Because like I said just before, delayed obedience is disobedience. Seemingly it sounds like these people were like, well, why can't we let them say bye to their father? Why can't we let them say bye to their family? And let's see what the notes are here for that. Luke doesn't say whether the father was already dead or just terminally ill. Jesus was saying that true discipleship requires instant action. Jesus did not teach people to forsake responsibilities to family, but he often gave commands to people in light of their real motives. Following Jesus has a cost, and each of us must be ready to share or serve even when it requires sacrifice. So maybe when we're reading it, we thought they had good intentions, but Jesus actually knew that they were stalling, so that's why he said it the way he did. It says, Jesus wants total dedication from us, not half-hearted commitment. We can't pick and choose among Jesus's ideas and follow him selectively. We have to accept the cross along with the crown. We must count the cost and be willing to abandon everything else that has given us security without looking back. Our focus is only Jesus. All right, guys, that's it for that chapter. I'll see you on the next one. Don't forget to check out the Etsy shop. Bye.